Well, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me loud and clear? Good. That is fantastic. Well, welcome to this really important event on the climate crisis, how it's affecting the education of some of our most marginalised children, and very importantly, what action we are all going to take to address this. My very special thanks to Minister Tinnerheim from Norway, sitting on the front row, and to my dear friend Minister David Senge from Sierra Leone for being with us today. And I'm also absolutely delighted to be co-chairing this panel discussion with our very special youth advocate Nena from Transform Education in partnership with Plan UK. And Nena, do you want to just say a quick hi now? Is it on? I think.
Is it?
Yeah, okay. We can hear you.
Fantastic. Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. My name is Nena, I'm from Transform Education, which is a coalition of feminist youth-led networks and activists hosted by the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative. I'm also a human rights student at the London School of Economics, and here at COP I'm mainly looking at climate justice and gender equality. I'm really curious to see what this discussion will have to bring. Thank you.
Great to have you with us, Nena. Anyway, I am hugely honoured to be leading this event with Nena as the UK Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Girls' Education. And my role is very much to globally champion his message that providing every girl on the planet with 12 years of quality education is one of the best ways of tackling many of the major issues facing the world today, including poverty, inequality, and, of course, climate change. And climate change, we know, is a major disruptor to education. And we also know that girls are more disproportionately affected than boys are. Flooding destroys schools, the degradation of the environment force families to flee, and droughts mean that families don't have enough money to send their children to school. And with 200 million of our most vulnerable women and girls living at the front line of climate change, we know that we will not be able to deal with and achieve SDG 4 without tackling climate change. But we also know that providing girls with quality education can make a huge difference in addressing climate change and its impact. Education allows our girls and women to participate much more in decisions, actions, and leadership in relation to resilience, adaptation, and mitigation. And this is why the UK is working at a global leadership level in driving education policy and the financing of it. By way of example, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has put championing 12 years of quality education at the very heart of the G7 presidency. We've also agreed 2 new global targets, ambitious targets, of getting 20 more million girls reading by the age of 10 and 40 million more girls in primary and secondary school in low to middle income countries by 2026. And at the Global Education Summit that we co-hosted with Kenya in London in July, with our international partners, we raised a landmark $4 billion, which will help up to 175 million more children to learn. Achieving these ambitious goals and targets is critical to the climate response, providing girls with the skills not just to survive, but to really thrive in an ever-changing world. Having an effective emergency education response is also vital. And the UK is proud to be a founding member and the largest donor to Education Cannot Wait. ECW, as we call it, as many of you will know, specialise in keeping children learning in emergencies such as cyclones and droughts and hurricanes and other conflict and crises. And we hope we really hope that the international community will rally to ensure that ECW is fully resourced through sustainable multi-year funding. And to support these efforts, I'm very pleased to announce today that the UK will provide £85,000 to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre to produce better information on the education needs of displaced children. This will help to ensure a more effective response. I know the weight of the challenge with both climate change and girls' education is very, very significant. But our ability to make change in the world, if we work together, should never be underestimated. And I hope that this event, and the COP more broadly, will be a great launch pad to harness the power of education to secure the future of young people all around the world. So I'm now going to hand over, in fact, I'm delighted to hand over to one of our key partners in education in emergency, Minister Tinnerheim from Norway. Minister.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this important event. Excellency, colleagues, dear friends, education, access to education is a fundamental human right. It's also one of the most powerful weapons we have to combat poverty. But we know that climate change is restricting girls and boys from getting that education, and that happens in a number of ways. It might be through increased migration, through poverty, malnutrition, and also, as mentioned, the direct impact on school infrastructure and supplies. In order to reach the SDG 4, we need to make sure that children affected by climate change can continue their education. But climate change does not only, it doesn't only affect the delivery of education, the relationship is also the other way around. Because we know that with education, we can prevent and prepare for emergency. So that gives us an opportunity as well. Educated children and educated families and communities are much better prepared to respond and to recover after crisis. So education enables them to become part of the climate solution. Also, very, very important to remember is that, during a crisis, school represents a sense of normality for children amidst a chaotic situation. And that is so important. And also, as mentioned, girls and women are disproportionately affected. And that means we must have a special focus on girls. We know that once the girls are out of school, they are much less likely to come back. And the pandemic has taught us a lesson in that respect, unfortunately. Norway supports programs to assure continued education in the face of climate crisis. We are proud to be among the founders of Education Cannot Wait. We are a vice chair in the executive committee and a large donor. And this fund supports education for children and youth affected by crisis, including climate change related disasters. And Education Cannot Wait has, for instance, provided support to countries like South Sudan, Somalia, Haiti, which we know have been largely affected by natural disasters. On and on, again and again. Education and climate change must be put higher on the international agenda, and Norway commends the UNESCO's efforts to make education a more central and visible part of the response to climate change. The organization supports member states with policy guidance and technical supports. We commend that. I think we're only beginning to grasp what impact climate change has on education. And I'm very grateful to the organizers of this event. Thank you for inviting us. I hope that this discussion will inspire us all to step up. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. I wasn't sure whether I'll step in. Thanks very much. So, good morning, and I guess good afternoon, good evening to those of you joining online. So, my name is Graham Lang. I'm the Chief of Education from Education Cannot Wait, been referred to this morning. So, we're just going to see some footage from some of the countries that we have visited as part of our multi-year resilience programs, which have been and are continue to be affected by climate change. And we'll see just this in the video, the impact on some of these learners as a result of these changes, particularly, for example, on infrastructure, as you were mentioning, and the impact that has on absenteeism, on dropout rates, on the mental health and psychosocial status of these children. So maybe if we can go over to the video and show the video if that's ready, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
abana biga ngaha kuri aya mashuri nta bikoresho bikwiye bafise. Muri ico gihe bigatuma abana bamwe bashobora guheba ishure, mugabo kubera ibiza by'isibe byateye ku musozi wa Nyempondo bituma abana baza gusaba ibibanza ngaha.
Habanika muri lycée communale Nyamakara. Kuri lycée communale Nyamakara bajya mu Gaseza. Jewe ndagenda nk'isaha. Kandi imvura izindutse gwancancererwa amanota bakaba bayakuye.
I'm here today with Education Cannot Wait in Mugina, in Cibitoke province in northwest Burundi, seeing firsthand the impact of climate change on education. A landslide destroyed a village nearby and the entire village was displaced. Children lost their access to education.
Climate-induced natural disasters, such as floods and landslides, have forcibly displaced tens of thousands of people, and there's an urgent need for us to step up our support.
This is not the time to just talk and talk, but this is the time to put action into our countries, into our societies, and look for ways that are going to sustain our lives.
应该让我们你的上电视，让我们县里的人都知道要爱护环境。
পড়াশোনা করলে তো আমার অনেক ভালো হতো। আমি একটা টিচার হইতে পারতাম, চাকরি করতে পারতাম বড় ধরনের।
এটার উপরে যে আমার মনটা ভালো লাগে না, যে পড়ালেখা হতাই না যে খেলাতে পারে।
We demand a safe future. Is that really too much to ask?
Children are not asking too much. The climate crisis is here, and their education cannot wait. We must act together. We must act now.
Well, thank you, Graham, for that very powerful video. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Minister David Senge from Sierra Leone. David, you can take the podium or stay, whichever is podium. Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the organizers to bring in a matter that really is important to all of us. I mean, I think when we speak about climate crisis, we maybe think that these are events that happen once in a while. There's a flooding here, there's a mudslide there. It happened in 2017 in Sierra Leone. But actually, the reality is it's happening every day. And very often I go to schools across Sierra Leone and I meet children who cannot go to school because it was windy the previous night and they blew away the roofs. And you meet teachers who cannot be in class teaching because they are helping their children or responding to flooding in their communities. So I did just want to start by saying this may seem like it's singular events, big tornado that comes blowing in the community once every while, or some flooding that happens across the season, and to say that's not always the case. In fact, it's a climate crisis that happens every day, and that this means our children are not learning. I did want to maybe speak a little bit about how we've experienced it in Sierra Leone and what the ways in which we are responding to climate crisis, and perhaps call a call to action for all of us to consider as we move forward. You know, in Sierra Leone, we had a mudslide in 2017 that had hundreds of people who died and lots who were displaced. In 2019, we had lots of flooding, and including this year in 2020 in Freetown as well, Thompson Bay, we had kids who are displaced because of flooding. As we've heard from the previous speaker, when schools close, the people who suffer the most are girls and the poor and those who are vulnerable. And in Ebola, for example, when schools closed for an extended period of time, we had estimates of up to 14,000 girls who got pregnant. And these challenges affect the people who are in the hardest to reach areas, who are disconnected, the people who are poorer, and girls in particular. And this is why in Sierra Leone, parts of what we are trying to do is develop and implement policies that are advocating for those who are most vulnerable, those who are most at risk. The girls, pregnant girls, the poor, those who are in hard-to-reach areas. And one of the policies that we have developed is called radical inclusion, which is essentially saying that we'll stop at nothing until those most vulnerable are brought in and are given access to the same quality education that exists. We know we can do more. We know we can invest in more evidence. I think the decisions we as policymakers make, not just for education, but also in response to the climate, has to be driven by evidence-based policy. And at the heart of that is climate education. Climate education cannot be a side conversation. It has to be a foundational piece, because the climate crisis is it's not about the future. It's about now. And the people who are both now and who are going to be involved in the future are the children. And so the investments that we make in schools and for the children and for the teachers really matter. And we have to coordinate across all of our ministries of environment, our ministries of education, disaster response, because until we're able to have these radical policies, until we can build hybrid solutions that work on paper, on radio, on TV, on mobile, until we're able to expand financing, including in periods of COVID when it feels like we should take money from education and do other things, until we understand that the crisis for education, when you talk about health crisis, you talk about climate crisis, you talk about economic crisis, as has often been expressed, the silver bullet is education. And so the call of action really is that in these times when it feels like our impulse reaction is to remove money from education and put it in those places, that's when we have to put in more resources towards education. And this is really important, and it's no different when we talk about the climate crisis. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, David. And now over to Rosella to introduce another video.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Rossella Pagliuchilor. I'm the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency's UK representative. I've got the pleasure of introducing another video, and this time we'll be hearing directly from refugees. How do they see the impact and the needs for education, the impact of lack of education and the needs for education in their lives?
Hello, I'm Yves, a refugee living in Zimbabwe. The climate crisis, storms, droughts, and other extreme weather events all contribute to higher and higher levels of displacement in the world. Those already displaced are particularly at risk. Damaged infrastructure can result in disruption to education. This can be very traumatic for young people, many of whom have already seen their homes being destroyed due to conflict or were forced to flee. Exposure to traumatic events directly impacts on children's ability to learn. The climate crisis has a direct impact on food security. Damage to agricultural lands undermines food sufficiency and increases dependency on assistance programs. There is need for investment towards refugee livelihoods and education. Refugees can actively contribute to being part of the solution, both locally and at a global level. Around the world, there are refugees engaged in university studies and research projects and initiatives focused on addressing climate solutions, including environmentally friendly, clean energy solutions. Young people's voices play an important part in calling for action on the climate crisis. The climate emergency wasn't something of our making, but we are part of the solution. I've worked on a number of climate change projects for the safekeeping of our environment, which includes design of solar poultry incubators, solar food dryers, solar system designs and installations, reforestation, cleaning up campaigns, and waste management projects. My future plans include facilitating training programs on renewable energy technologies to the refugee community. Everyone needs to join in taking action to address the environmental impacts of modern living, from how we live in our homes to the practices of large cooperation. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Tanda Aung, a refugee from Myanmar, currently living in New Delhi, India. Climate change makes the refugees more prone to face our challenges. I myself, being a refugee, have faced, experienced and observed many circumstances where climate change has overshadowed our lifestyle. One heavy rain or flood strikes our home. Refugees are most prone to suffer because of the lack of a good housing. And one climate hits our crops. Refugees are most prone to starvation because most of us cannot make up to the high price of foods. And one new variants of pathogens like bacteria, virus arise in our environment, like in water. Most of the refugees are prone to sickness because most of us don't have advanced water purification system or filters installed at our homes. And at this pace of climate change, it is being predicted that climate refugees will rise like a steep in upcoming years. At that time, most people will be forced to flee from their homes. So this should be focused by most of the governments. Migration, having traumatic experience and adapting to new environment, according to my understanding, it is a big challenge. So we must prepare this in advance, and we must join our hands to prepare for the betterment of upcoming climate refugees. And to relieve this situation, we can do by reducing climate change, and we should support scientists and young minds behind it. And I myself have taken many scientific innovative projects on climate change. I believe that science plays a big role in it. It's not only my concern, it's not only your concern, it's not only refugees' concern, but it's our concern and it's everyone's concern. So I would like to end this by addressing one question to panel members, that how global community is aware about the specific threat that climate crisis pose to the education system. Is enough being done to create awareness how education system is affected? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you, Rosella, for that really, again, another powerful video, really showing two very special young people making their voices heard. And I would now like to begin the panel discussion by directing the question that Thandar put, firstly to Gillian Caldwell. Gillian, to my left, Senior Climate Advisor at USAID, and I shall just repeat it. How aware is the global community of the specific threats that the climate crisis poses to education systems? And very importantly, is enough being done to raise awareness of how education is affected? Gillian.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yes, I'm Gillian Caldwell, USAID's new agency-wide climate change coordinator, and USAID is the Agency for International Development, so we have a very broad mandate, and we see the climate crisis as one of the very top imperatives for the agency. So we are designing, and I am helping lead, a strategy for a whole-of-agency response. You know, there was just one reference thus far to pathogens, and of course, you know, we're all sitting here with masks because of zoonotic transfer, and that's animal to human transfer of disease. And sadly, we can predict much more zoonotic transfer in the context of the climate crisis. And, you know, you ask about the awareness of the international community. I think we're all very aware of the threat to education, especially if we make the connection between the pandemic and the climate crisis and recognize there may be more to come. And, of course, no, not enough is being done. You know, there's so much more that's necessary, and I think, you know, the prior speakers have made those points quite beautifully. Certainly at USAID, we've had some forward-thinking field missions that did some advanced work in Indonesia, for example, to predict flooding and to prepare education systems for resilience. But it wasn't really until the pandemic hit that we started thinking much more seriously. And our education team is now, in fact, although their funding is earmarked to support primary and secondary numeracy and literacy, they're reshaping their entire curriculum to make climate-related content central to how people learn and to the training they get. So even with restricted funding, this is how we can move to a whole-of-agency response, is recognize that climate change touches everything we do, and there's an opportunity to intervene strategically, even when it might not seem directly relevant.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and especially for being with us today, and lovely to meet you. David, have you got some thoughts on this particular question?
I think it's... we are trying, but a lot more can be done. And I also think things need to be done not tomorrow, but today. And I'll give you an example. With a conversation I had with my director of planning in Sierra Leone this morning. They're currently on the road across Sierra Leone, engaging with stakeholders from all the different districts on our education sector plan. The education sector plan is a 5-year document that is being developed with all the stakeholders from pre-primary all the way to technical and higher education, and it is what we will use to get financing from GPE and also from our domestic budget. And it's been a very inclusive process, sector review, dialogues, and all of that. And yesterday I was on a panel that was talking about climate education, and I went back and I looked at the draft that was sent to me, and climate was not a major part of our ESP. So I called my director and I said, look, fantastic work that you're doing with the ESP, but I need you to do something. I need you to add a section in the ESP on climate. And it's important to mention this because our responsiveness cannot be, we don't wait until tomorrow for our responsiveness. If we believe in this stuff that we're talking about, because it's so real, then the policymakers and the decision makers have to make that decision today. And so, yes, more can be done. And in Sierra Leone, in our ESP that will be developed, that we are committing to bring to our development partners, we will have climate there. The second thing that I also did was we have the annual school census. And the annual school census, we measure 100 to 200 different variables every year across all schools. I asked the team that will be doing the annual school census between now and December to include the question on climate, and so that we can sit down and begin to understand what we need to measure. So to answer her question, we are aware, but more needs to be done, and those decisions have to happen today, not tomorrow.
Thank you, David. And Nena, over to you, and then I think you're picking up my baton, aren't you? Over to you to chair the rest. But it'd be good to have your thoughts on this particular question too.
Fantastic, thank you. I've heard David say more can be done. I would say we're not doing enough. The global community, if they're aware, I'm not seeing it. None of the NDCs explicitly recognize the power education has in tackling the climate crisis. I also don't hear the global community talk about the impact of climate disasters on education, specifically girls, indigenous peoples, children from marginalized backgrounds. I don't hear the global community talk enough about the estimated 12.5 million girls who won't complete their education yearly by 2025. Nor do I hear the global community talk about the reality of girls out of school today due to climate impacts. What I do hear, when we mention education and the climate crisis in one sentence, it's at panels like these where we say, how does the climate crisis deny children their right to education? And I think we need to reflect on that and perhaps rephrase, because it's very easy to blame the climate crisis, but we need to be way more specific. What is denying children their right to education? Not including young people in decision-making spaces about our present and our future is denying children their right to education. Not being ambitious enough to stay below 1.5 degrees is denying children their right to education. And sorry to be frank, but the UK government cutting their foreign aid to education with 30% is also denying children their right to education. So is the global community aware? Are they raising awareness? I would say definitely not enough, and perhaps not at all. Even if they're aware, awareness is not enough. We needed awareness before I was born. What we need now is concrete action. I cannot wrap my head around the lack of ambition, the lack of urgency in the ACE negotiations that I joined. I cannot wrap my head around the fact that the only article that covers education does not recognize the disproportionate impact on girls. What I can say to all of you, the international community, I can say to myself, is that we need to look into the mirror and we need to think of what we're doing and what we're not doing. So I'm really glad that here I've heard in the remarks, I've heard people speak on the gendered impact. So I hope that this panel discussion can go beyond raising awareness and really speak on the specific things that need to be done. So to lead it into our panel discussion, I think the first question I have is for Rosella and Graham, which is what we've seen in the video as well. We see that extreme weather events and other climate shocks often disrupt access to education. And what would you say works to minimize the negative impact on children who are displaced by them? Rosella, I'd like to ask this to you first.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nena. Well, I think it's, at least here, we all know that this is already happening. I think we have heard it. I'm not sure that in other places they know it, though. And I think this also reflects the lack of urgency that sometimes we hear. No, here we're preaching to the choir in some ways. Already, every year there are 20 million new displaced persons. And of course, the vast majority of them is because of climate events. And 75 million kids have their education disrupted every year, again, with girls being disproportionately affected. So we are talking about something that is happening now. We have the data. We all, at least here, believe that education is really central to the life of children, but also to the life of their communities. So I think we got the knowledge, we got the awareness, and we got the data. And I think that with that, we have both the ability and the responsibility to act. Now, straight coming to your question, what can we do? Well, one of the things which is really fundamental, of course, is advanced planning. We know it happens. Well, we can respond much better if we have plans already in place. And so, where, for example, governments already have policy frameworks and administrative system in place that allow displaced children to almost seamlessly enter into education with all the necessary, help that may be required, for example, if they need to learn a new language or if they need to catch up on academic work. Handling disruption as quickly as possible is fundamental, because we know that if kids remain outside of school, the longer they stay out of education, the harder it will be to get them back into it. So and I think here I would like to refer to what Minister Sange said, where I think talking about really preparation, having plans, looking at safe education and safe environments, and for example the use of technology, whether it is internet or the use of radio, for example, to try and bridge that gap as far as possible. And of course the importance of not focusing only on primary education, which we normally tend to do in emergencies. Children need more than primary education, and for example, refugee kids already are deprived to a very large extent of secondary education. Only about 34% of them manage to get a secondary degree. University. Let us not forget that many students' university education is disrupted. Now, these are really the people that the community will rely on as they move forward. And let me just to conclude what has already been said, education is not a standalone. And in order to support education, and I close, we really need to make sure that families have the security and the health and the livelihoods they need. Hungry kids don't learn. Starving families need the work of their kids. So it's important, fundamentally important, to look at this as a overall package of support for families, individuals, and communities.
Thank you so much. And Graham, what are your thoughts?
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, I think we see many things actually from our partners on the ground that they're doing that are working. Coming back to your point about concrete measures to really minimize the negative impact of these climate-induced displacements on children. Many things. I want to concentrate quickly on 4, and you'll cut me off if I go too long. I think the first one already been mentioned, but is really about minimizing the time that children are out of learning. So getting them back, and all children. I want to focus on all children, getting all children from preschool, particularly through until the end of secondary, also including university, but that age back into learning as quickly as possible. So continuity is really key following a displacement. And that means different things in different contexts. But what we see a lot of the time is it means creating safe, protective, temporary learning spaces where children can go to learn. It also enabling local providers, local first responders with the funds, the materials to provide teaching and learning materials, complementing that with water and sanitation facilities, and going further, looking at incentives, things like cash transfers and school feeding programs. So that's the first point, getting them back quickly. Secondly, it goes beyond education, as you said, Rosella. It goes far beyond education. It's not just these physical inputs. You know, the impact of these displacements, and we have mentioned several times, the impact on girls and the disproportionate impact, but also particularly on children with disabilities, those most vulnerable groups that are often just invisible in the system and left behind. They need additional support to be following a displacement to ensure that they also have access to education. So it's also matching that physical response with a response that enables all learners to access education in a safe and protective space and ensure their well-being. Now, the third point, no one actor, again, Rosella, as you said, no one actor is able to provide that sort of response. And what we have seen where it works is where you have a very well-coordinated, multi-sectoral response to those displacements. So you're working not just with education actors, but you're working, as you said, with health, with nutrition, with food security, so that you have that holistic response. And lastly, and it comes to your point, and I use a phrase often in ECW, which is that we are unapologetically impatient. And it's about the speed of the funding. It's about ensuring that following a displacement as a result of a climate-induced disaster, that we get that funding quickly into the hands of those first-line responders so that they can deliver quickly on those actions. And I think that's the sort of mechanism that we have, for example, in Education Cannot Wait, thanks to our donors, that is able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for mentioning funding. At Transform Education, we developed a youth-led statement of recommendations, and we think that funding plays such a key part in advancing climate justice through gender equality, through education. So I really wanted to ask this next question both to Minister Senge and Gillian, which is what government policies could make education systems more resilient to climate shocks in developing countries? Minister Senge, would you want to answer that first?
I think financing policy is the primary policy, and I, the Minister of Finance was here with me, and we went a long drive together the other day, and he kept saying, and education is the government's flagship, and we're always asking for money. And it's like, you're always taking all of my money, David, and and he's lovely, and he understands the need to that we need to invest in education. And as I mentioned, Sierra Leone expanded its education budget in the year of COVID, when it's not like we had lots of money coming. And that's the primary policy, which is where you started from, is a commitment that our education budgets and our education budget to GDP has to meet the international targets. So minimum 20% of the budget, 5% GDP. And we are at 22% of the budget, but about 3% of GDP. So it's one or the other. But hopefully countries can commit to doing both. And so, as you are unapologetically impatient, I'm unapologetic with asking for more money for education. And so even though the Minister of Finance will say you're always seeking more money, I smile and I go, yes, but we need more. And I think that's important. And it's not... and this element of radical inclusion that I mentioned. So radical inclusion in Sierra Leone targets 4 groups. Okay, it targets pregnant girls and parent learners, and this is really important because, as we saw in many countries, I think in Kenya, you see teenage pregnancy go up 3x. Actually, people expected that in Sierra Leone, teenage pregnancy will go up 3x as well, but because of the interventions that we did, and I was looking at the data from Aberdeen Women's Center, teenage pregnancy did not go up, even though we changed the policy to allow pregnant girls to come back to school. So it's just this myth versus data. So pregnant girls and parent learners, kids with disabilities, seen in visible and invisible disabilities. Often we're and we're guilty of that. I was at the deaf school the other day. I had not been. I'd been to the blind school, which is next to the deaf school for hearing impaired. The sheer offense. I'd been to the blind school for the blind 7, 8, 9 times, but I'd never been to the deaf school. And one of somebody had to call me out and be like, look, these are also, they need help, You can't just go to the school for the blind all day and engage with them, but not come here. So I went there and I spent a lot of time, and these visible and invisible disabilities are equally important. So disabilities. The third group is those who are in hard-to-reach areas. And there are some schools that I go to, you get out of your car, you sit in the boat for 3 hours, you cross and you walk in. We have to go there. They have to see us. Those people have never seen a minister or a minister of education before. They don't. And we have to reach those. Books have to reach those. Radio service has to reach there. And so it's your responsibility to put the transmission. And the fourth group is poor people. I think you do mention these cash transfers. And often we think, it's just welfare. But if somebody's poor, you have to support them to get out of poverty with education and the direct cash transfer if that's what you need. And so my team now is we're looking at there's a poverty report that the World Bank and the Statistics Sierra Leone came up with, and I asked to look at the data for those with 90% poverty index in those chiefdoms, and we have to have a special welfare package for them. We can't continue expecting that people will get out of poverty by saying, oh, they just need to work harder. We can't create dependency. Nobody gets out of poverty that way. And so these cost money, but these are bold policies that we have to implement to ensure. So for me in Sierra Leone, and I think everywhere, is radical inclusion.
Thank you. I definitely relate to smiling and asking for more. Gillian, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, so I would agree that funding first and foremost when it comes to policy, budget policy is kind of where the rubber hits the road when it comes to decision making and prioritization. USAID actually recently announced a grant to Education Cannot Wait of $37 million. And we're also the largest bilateral funder of international basic education. So through our support, we reached 24 million children in 57 countries worldwide last year. But it's still not enough. I'm not suggesting it is. But I am saying it's a real priority and will continue to be a priority, especially with a climate lens. I think the other important thing to think about is beyond the funding decisions is the technical assistance and the preparedness. So we have a number of tools that are available online, both returning to learning, which is really a crisis toolkit, as well as a distance learning toolkit, which is very relevant in the current context, which leads me to another point, which is that if we're not serious about mitigation, we're not serious about education. So, as we think about education, we need to be thinking about ensuring that the 750 million people worldwide that lack electricity are getting electricity through renewable sources, that we're leapfrogging over fossil fuel infrastructure in doing so. And our Power Africa program is working very hard to try to electrify Africa, where 500 million of those 750 million people live. And of course, without electricity, it is very hard for families to get educated. So I think it's got to be a very comprehensive response that goes beyond funding, and that really thinks about the underlying drivers, not just the symptoms of the problems we're confronting.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So in the interest of time, we're going to do the last question as a super quick fire round. So I want to go past everyone, and if you can answer in one sentence, I think that would be fantastic. So how can donors, multilaterals, and developing countries work together so that there are sufficient resources for the scale of this challenge? Sorry, Rosella, would you like to go first?
One sentence only. It's a challenge. A shared vision, I would say, with a multi-stakeholder approach, a whole society approach, and a willingness to put up the money up front, because it's much easier to find money for a crisis after it has happened rather than to invest in mitigation measure before it has happened. I don't know how many times we have rebuilt certain schools, frankly. A lot cheaper to spend money and get them right from the beginning.
Fantastic. Minister Senge.
I think ambition and flexibility. We have to be ambitious with our targets, as you'd mentioned. And we as partners and everybody have to be flexible enough to understand that when we need to make changes, those changes need to be responsive to the context of those countries. As Minister of Education of a developing country whose budget is mostly dependent on external funding, sometimes I'm in these meetings and I find it quite annoying and frustrating at the inflexibility of our partners in understanding that, this is what we said 2 years ago that we should spend this money on, but the reality on the ground is this. And you're like, nope, this is what you wrote 2 years ago, you have to do that. And you're like, so more flexibility in partnerships.
Thank you. Gillian.
I think beyond what's already been said, I think we need to get beyond our own egos a bit. If we're talking about collaboration when it comes to multilaterals and governments and NGOs, there's a sort of scramble for visibility and a spotlight in that context. And I think, it's really going to take a whole of society approach and collaboration. So to the extent we can think really carefully about core competencies and come together without worrying so much about the brand, I think it'll really make a difference.
Thank you so much. And finally, Graham.
Thanks, Anna. I had a whole page of comments, but I'll summarize it very quickly. I mean, I know perhaps everybody here, and like we've heard it today, and particularly at this conference, there's a lot of calls for extra money. But frankly, the pot does need to get bigger. And we need to be more clever with how we make that happen. I think we need to be ramping up our advocacy work with governments, with private sector, with foundations, and using the evidence. And there's a great statistic around education of girls in countries where governments have invested more in the education of girls. They've had fewer droughts and fewer floods than countries that haven't invested that same level. And we need to use that kind of language and those kinds of messages with those donors to raise that money and to increase our efforts on that front. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I mean, this has been super, super insightful for me, so thank you all. Helen, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much indeed to our excellent panel, and that was superbly co-chaired, Nana. Round of applause. Brilliant, brilliant. I would now like to introduce our final recorded intervention. This time it's from Filippo Grandi, UN Commissioner for Refugees, and Yasmin Sharif, Director of ECW.
Climate crisis is an education crisis. We often get the question, what is the correlation between climate change and emergencies and access to equality education? And it isn't that complicated. I've seen it with my own eyes. When you have desertification, and you have agriculturalists and pastoralists entering into armed conflicts, like in Darfur. And who are the ones who suffer? It's the children and the adolescents, and most of all the girls. Their schools are closed. They become refugees and internally displaced. The teachers can no longer access their schools. The children have to stay at home. The young people find other, less desirable alternatives to survive their lives. It's estimated that about 140 million children and youth will be affected by 2050 if we don't act now. I appeal to all our partners, all our strategic donor partners, of course the United Kingdom being our number one partner out of 21, but all of you, and all of you who haven't joined Education Cannot Wait yet, please support us to act fast when there's a climate-induced disaster, to act with emergency in weeks to prevent a disruption of education and to help countries and nations to mitigate the impact of climate-induced disasters, preparedness to make sure that schools are no longer destroyed because nature has been disrupted in its own ecosystem and therefore also disrupt the human system of accessing a quality education. We need funding. We are agile, we are fast, and we take action. And we need you to work with us. So I appeal to all of you, please fund education and emergency improved rapid crisis. Fund the access to a continued quality education with a big emphasis on the girls' access. So let's take preventive action and reparative action now. Let's not wait. Education cannot wait. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
%90 of refugees under UNHCR's mandate and 70% of internally displaced people are from countries vulnerable to the climate emergency. Their lives and the lives of the communities hosting them are closely tied to threats arising from global heating and extreme weather events. As with many humanitarian crises, the most vulnerable are worst impacted by food shortages, damage to their homes, and lost livelihoods. Around the world, in Afghanistan, the Sahel, for example, we see the complex linkages between peace, security, climate, and environmental degradation, displacement, and the need for humanitarian action. As we heard earlier, refugees are not just affected by the climate crisis, but they are also active contributors to efforts to find the solutions to the challenges facing their communities and the world. Education is one of the tools that prepares young people to understand the climate crisis and be equipped to act. When people are displaced, education is one of the first services requested. We need to ensure that children and young people are able to return to learning as quickly as possible, ideally within 3 months of displacement. 48% of refugee children are not in school, and as climate displacement worsens, there is a danger that this will increase. The COVID-19 pandemic showed the negative effects, emotional and academic, that occur when access to education is disrupted. If we want to ensure a better future for all, we need to work collectively to ensure that these disruptions are minimized. UNHCR therefore calls on donors and governments to demonstrate greater international solidarity to respond to displacement arising from complex emergencies. Investment needs to be both local and through supporting education systems to respond quickly to crises and ensure the continuity of learning in ways that benefit the most marginalized.
Well, we are almost out of time, but I just wanted to make one or two closing remarks in the last couple of minutes. As I said at the start of today's event, the scale of the challenge that we face demands concerted, collective action. And I sincerely want to thank everyone here today for participating, for sharing your energy, your ideas, your expertise. We've heard about the impact that climate is having from ministers, other leaders, young leaders, new leaders, and also our young refugee students, Yves and Thandar, who spoke so passionately about the role they're playing in the response for their communities. We know that extreme weather events are increasing the size and frequency, creating further barriers to education in fragile countries where children already face far too many obstacles. An effective emergency education response is one of the best ways that we can ensure that the most marginalised children continue to learn in times of crisis. Education cannot wait. ECW is our emergency education response mechanism. And as I said earlier, in order to play its role, it must have the sustainable multi-year funding it needs to really rise to the challenge. As our Prime Minister said at the Global Education Summit, if you give every girl in the world 12 years of quality education, then you perform the most fantastic benefits for humanity, from lifting life expectancy to increasing per capita GDP to helping to tackle climate change. Girls' education is so important. So I hope what has been said today inspires us all to redouble our efforts, sharpen our focus and take real, true action. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.